December 1287. The kind of cold that does not merely chill, it accuses. It seeps through chainmail, through wool, through skin, through bone, until a man cannot tell where the winter ends and his own dread begins. Across the frost-hardened plains of Lesser Poland, the sky hung low and iron grey, as though the heavens themselves had pressed down to watch what was coming. The Vistula River groaned beneath the weight of ice that had not yet fully formed, cold enough to threaten, not cold enough to cross. Trees stood stripped and skeletal along the ridgelines of the Świętokrzyskie mountains, their bare branches clawing upward like the arms of men drowning in snow. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. And then, from the east, the earth began to tremble. They came like a dark tide that had no shore to stop it. 30,000 horsemen of the Golden Horde, the greatest cavalry force on earth, poured across the Polish-Galician border in two massive columns, their felt banners snapping in the frozen wind, their horses breathing steam into the killing air. To see them from a hilltop was to watch the horizon itself come alive and turn predatory. Each man was hardened leather and iron will, raised in the saddle before he could walk, trained to loose arrows at full gallop with enough force to punch through an oak plank. Behind their columns rode the Ruthenian vassal armies of 3 princes, who had no choice but to follow. And at the head of it all, 2 of the most powerful men in the world rode side by side and despised each other with every mile. Opposite them stood Poland, fractured, feuding, exhausted Poland, a country that had been invaded by these same horsemen not once, not twice, but already twice before, and had survived both times only by the grace of God and the mercy of Mongol calendars. In 1241, Krakow had burned. In 1259, Polish lords had been forced to tear down their own walls with their own hands, so the Mongols would have nothing to besiege. The psychological weight of those humiliations was not a memory. It was a living thing, passed from father to son, from priest to congregation, from the charred foundations of razed churches to the nightmares of men who had never even been born when the first riders came. But something was different this time. Something had changed in the limestone bones of this battered kingdom. Something quiet, something deliberate, something the Mongols never anticipated, because they had never needed to anticipate it from Poland before. This time, Poland had a plan. This time, the man defending this frozen land did not scatter his forces and pray for winter to arrive early. He did not abandon his capital and flee south into Hungary with his court and his gold. He did not tear down his walls in submission. Instead, Duke Leszek II, the Black, had spent years quietly transforming Lesser Poland into something that had never existed here before. A fortress system designed specifically to break the one thing that made the Golden Horde invincible: its speed, its hunger, and its absolute certainty that no one in Europe could stop it. The Mongols called themselves the Army of God's Punishment. They were not wrong to do so. 46 years of Polish nightmares agreed with that description. But on the frozen plains and mountain passes of Lesser Poland, in the winter of 1287 to 1288, something extraordinary happened. The punishment did not land. The trap snapped shut. And for the first time in the bloody history of the Mongol invasion of Poland, the Horde did not return home with a conquered kingdom behind them. They returned home defeated, humiliated, and diminished, their Khan fleeing under cover of snowstorm, their advance column annihilated in a mountain ambush they never saw coming. Their supreme general personally ordering a retreat that the entire world had been told was impossible. This is the story of how Poland broke the Mongol war machine. Not through miracle, not through luck, but through cold intelligence, stone walls, and the nerve of one duke who refused to run. To understand what happened in the winter of 1287, you must first understand what the name Mongol meant to a Polish man in the 13th century. It was not simply the name of an enemy. It was the name of apocalypse. In the spring of 1241, they had arrived without warning, or rather, the warning had come, but no one had truly believed it. 3 armies of the Golden Horde erupted into Central Europe with a coordination so precise, so merciless, that Christian chroniclers genuinely debated whether these horsemen were human at all. One column swept through Poland like fire through dry grass, destroying Lublin, sacking Sandomierz, routing every Polish army that dared to stand in the open field. At Chmielnik, Polish knights charged with all the confidence of men who had never truly lost, and were shattered within the hour. At Legnica, Duke Henry II the Pious, the most powerful ruler in Silesia, gathered the best army Central Europe could assemble and rode out to meet them. The battle lasted long enough for Henry to realize his mistake. The Mongols feigned retreat, drew the knights forward into broken ground, and turned. Henry's head was mounted on a lance and paraded past the city gates. Krakow burned. Its citizens fled into the forests and the mountains, leaving behind everything they owned, everything their grandparents had built, everything that had taken 3 generations to raise from mud and timber into something resembling civilization. The Mongols did not linger. They had Hungary to conquer, and Poland was merely a flank-clearing operation. But the memory of what they left behind, the ash, the bones, the wells choked with bodies, that memory did not fade. It calcified into something permanent in the Polish national soul. They came again in 1259 and 1260, under the command of Burundai. And this time, the humiliation was even more comprehensive, because it required no battle at all. Burundai sent word to the Polish lords, "Tear down your walls, or we tear down your population." One by one, the dukes of Poland complied. Krakow's fortifications came down. Sandomierz's walls were demolished by Polish hands following Mongol orders. It was the deepest possible degradation, to be forced to unmake your own defences while the enemy watched. And when the Mongols left, they left behind a Poland that was not just physically damaged, but psychologically broken, stripped to the very structures that might protect it from the next visit. And everyone knew there would be a next visit. This was the world into which Leszek II the Black was born, around 1241, the very year of Legnica, the very year of the burning. His nickname appeared first in the chronicles of the following century, almost certainly given for his dark hair. But there was something else dark about Leszek, a quality of stubbornness, of grinding tenacity that suited the name perfectly. He was not a romantic figure. He was not a crusader poet or a chivalric ideal. He was a man who had watched his kingdom be humiliated twice in his lifetime, who had fought internal rebellions from his own nobles, who had been excommunicated and reconciled and betrayed again, and who had emerged from all of it with one singular, obsessive conviction: that the next time the Mongols came, Lesser Poland would not bend. He ruled as Duke of Sieradz from 1261, accumulated Łęczyca, Inowrocław, Sandomierz, and eventually the senior position of High Duke of Poland, not through military brilliance alone, but through the kind of relentless political manoeuvring that lesser men found exhausting and greater men found unnecessary. He fought the Bishop of Krakow over territorial rights for years. He suppressed a revolt by his own voivode in 1282, when his Castellan of Kraków handed over the fortresses of Sandomierz and Radom to a rival duke while Leszek was away. He crushed another uprising in 1285. He was never fully at peace, and he never expected to be. Peace, for Leszek, was simply the interval between threats. And the greatest threat, always, loomed from the east. So he built. Quietly, systematically, without announcing his intentions to the men who would one day ride against them, Leszek oversaw the transformation of Lesser Poland's defensive infrastructure. Where there had been wood, there was now stone. Where there had been earthen ramparts, there were now limestone walls thick enough to absorb siege engines. Kraków in particular received special attention. By 1287, its castle was constructed entirely of stone, its garrison equipped with catapults, large crossbows, and the most current in defensive technology that 13th century Central Europe could provide. Sandomierz was reinforced. The monastery of Wysagura, the Holy Cross Abbey on the mountain ridge at the heart of the Świętokrzyskie range, was converted into a fortified position. Tursko was hardened. The network of fortifications was not perfect, and it was not comprehensive, but it was built with one very specific scenario in mind. What happens when 30,000 horsemen who cannot take a stone wall are surrounded by stone walls? Now, from the east, the commanders of this new invasion. Talabuga Khan was, in the autumn of 1287, brand new to the most powerful throne in the Western Steppe. He had deposed, or murdered, depending on which chronicle you trust, the previous Khan, Toda Monka, a ruler who had descended into religious devotion and political irrelevance. Talabuga was young, ambitious, and desperately in need of a military victory that would prove to his generals and his vassal princes that he was capable of the role he had seized. He had fought in Lithuania, in Hungary, in Ruthenia. He had experience. What he did not have, and what he needed urgently, was a triumph that no one could dispute. Poland would be that triumph. Poland had always been that triumph, first for Batu, then for Burundi. It would be his turn now. Riding beside him, technically beneath him, but in practice beside him in every sense that mattered, that, because of a concubine in his ancestry, could never legitimately claim the throne of the Golden half of the empire for decades. He had married a daughter of the Byzantine emperor. He had installed and removed khans like a man rearranging furniture. He had fought from the Caucasus to the Danube, losing an eye in battle near Tiflis without slowing his campaign. He was, by 1287, perhaps 60 years old, and the most dangerous political mind in the steppe world. He and Talabuga had fought together in Hungary in 1285, and the campaign had been a disaster, repelled by Hungarian fortifications and ambushed by the Zekeli warriors on the retreat. They blamed each other for it. They had never stopped blaming each other. And now, by order of Talabuga, Nogai had gathered his own tumen of 10,000 riders and joined the march into Poland, not enthusiastically, but because refusal was not yet an option. The army that crossed into Polish territory in late 1287 was, by every measurable standard, overwhelming. 30,000 warriors, augmented by Ruthenian vassal forces under 3 princes who followed Talabuga not out of loyalty, but out of the clear-eyed understanding that defiance meant annihilation. The Galician-Volhynian Chronicle the most important primary source for this campaign, described the assembled force as a great host. The modern estimate of 30,000 cavalry, divided between Talabuga's 20,000 and Nogai's 10,000, represents the largest Mongol force ever directed at Poland. The plan was clean. Talabuga's northern column would sweep towards Sandomierz and the northern part of Lesser Poland, looting and destroying as it went. Nogai's southern column would strike toward Krakow. They would rendezvous north of the capital, combine their forces, sack Krakow and return east with prisoners and plunder, sufficient to make Talabuga's claim to the throne unquestionable. It was a good plan. It had worked before. And it had one catastrophic flaw that neither man was willing to admit, because admitting it would have required them to admit something about each other. They hated each other too much to cooperate. The ground itself was Poland's first ally. Anyone who has studied the Mongol way of war understands that it was inseparable from terrain. The Golden Horde's military genius, the feigned retreats, the encircling sweeps, the sudden multi-directional charges from seemingly empty horizons, required one thing above all else: space. Open space. The rolling grasslands of the Pontic steppe, where a column of 10,000 riders could disappear over a ridge and reappear 3 miles away without warning. The vast Hungarian plain, where cavalry could maneuver at will, and the horizon was always the only wall. The northern Chinese lowlands, where speed was the only relevant variable. Lesser Poland, in December 1287, was none of those things. The Świętokrzyskie Mountains, the Holy Cross Mountains, run east to west across the heart of Lesser Poland. And they are old mountains, in the way that only European ranges are old, worn down by time, dense with forest, cut through by narrow valleys and swift rivers that do not follow convenient routes. The ridgelines are modest in height, but treacherous in terrain, forested down to the waterline, offering almost no clear ground wide enough for a cavalry formation of any size to maneuver freely. The passes are few, predictable, and easily watched by a defender who has lived in them his entire life. In summer, these mountains were difficult. In December, with the ground frozen solid beneath a foot of snow and the trees stripped bare to reveal sight lines that did not exist in any warmer season, they were a different kind of killing ground entirely. One that a Polish duke, who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment, understood far better than any general raised on the Mongolian steppe. The Vistula River presented Talabuga's northern column with its first problem before a single battle had been fought. The standard Mongol invasion tactic relied on winter. Frozen rivers meant no barriers. Open ground meant maximum speed. And the psychological impact of an attack in what was supposed to be a resting season was itself a weapon. But in December of 1287, the Vistula near Zawichost had not fully frozen. It was cold enough to prevent easy crossing, not cold enough to bear the weight of 20,000 horsemen and their horses. Talabuga's column was forced to search southward for a ford, burning days in the process, losing the speed that was supposed to be their decisive advantage, announcing their presence to every Polish scout on the western bank. The river had not fought for Poland, but it had slowed the army that came to conquer Poland. And in a campaign where timing was everything, those lost days would prove to be among the most consequential moments of the entire invasion. While Talabuga's column struggled with geography on the northern axis, Nogai's southern force crossed into Polish territory on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1287, and arrived before the walls of Krakow. The choice of that date may have been coincidental. What was not coincidental was what Nogai found when he got there. The Krakow he rode up to was not the Krakow that his predecessors had torched in 1241. That Krakow had been a city of wood and earthen walls and hope, and it had burned in an afternoon. This Krakow had a castle built entirely of stone, walls thick enough to absorb catapult impact, and garrison troops equipped with the most formidable defensive weapons of the era. Large crossbows capable of driving a bolt through a mounted archer at 200 yards, and stone-throwing engines that could reach any position in the killing ground outside the walls. The city had learned its lesson in the most brutal possible classroom. It had rebuilt accordingly. Leszek's force, estimated at approximately 15,000 men, was a combined army that reflected the pragmatic military reality of fractured 13th century Poland. At its core were the ducal levies, professional fighting men drawn from the nobility of Kraków and Sandomierz, armoured in the Frankish-influenced plate and mail style that Central European warfare had evolved toward over the preceding century, and trained for the kind of close-quarters fighting that happened when two infantry formations collided in the narrow defiles of a forested mountain range. Supporting them were mounted knights from the Polish feudal nobility, men who rode not with the nomadic fluidity of the Mongol horse archer, but with the crashing, committed momentum of the Western-style cavalry charge, a style of fighting that was nearly useless in open engagement against Mongol tactics, but devastatingly effective in confined terrain, where maneuver was impossible, and only weight and armour mattered. Behind them came the urban militias of the fortified towns, crossbowmen, engineers, men who had been trained not to meet the enemy in the field, but to stand on walls and punish anyone who approached. And then there were the Gorals, the Gorals, the highland people of the Podhale region beneath the Tatra Mountains, were not professional soldiers in any conventional sense. They were shepherds, hunters, woodsmen, people who had lived their entire lives in the most rugged terrain in southern Poland. They knew every trail, every stream crossing, every hollow in the land where a man could hide, or from which a small group of determined fighters could strike without warning. They owned no formal allegiance to any particular duke's military structure. They fought for their land with whatever weapons they had: axes, hunting bows, farm implements converted to violence. And they fought with the intimate ferocity of people defending something they could not replace. When Nogai's southern column dispersed to raid the Podhale region after failing to breach Krakow's walls, the Gorals met them in the river valleys and the mountain passes, with ambushes that left Mongol raiding parties battered, confused, and unable to consolidate. The Battle of the Dunajec, small in scale, enormous in psychological impact, drove Mongol foragers out of the highland region entirely. These were not trained soldiers defeating a military force. These were mountain people defending their homes, and they won. The third and final element of Leszek's alliance was the Hungarian contingent. Before the invasion began, Leszek had travelled personally to the court of King Ladislaus IV of Hungary to request military assistance, a diplomatic move that demonstrated both the gravity of his concern and the quality of his strategic thinking. Ladislaus approved the request and tasked a nobleman named George of Sovar with commanding the expeditionary force. George's contingent travelled north through the mountain passes of the Carpathians, gathering additional Polish local forces along the way, and positioned itself in the south as the final component of the trap that Leszek had been constructing with the patience of a man who understood that improvisation against the Mongols was suicide. The night before the decisive engagements, Poland prayed. In the stone garrison of Sandomierz, men sharpened weapons they had already sharpened twice that day, because the hands needed something to do that the mind refused to provide. They whispered prayers to Saint Stanislaus, Poland's martyred bishop, the patron of the fractured kingdom, in voices too quiet to carry past the man beside them. Young soldiers who had never fought a proper battle held the mental image of their home villages the way a drowning man holds a rope, with everything they had, because to let go was to go under. Older veterans, men who had served in previous skirmishes, who had perhaps seen Mongol riders on the horizon years before, were quieter, and their silence said more than the prayers of the young ones. In Krakow's stone castle, Leszek himself stood on the rampart and looked east. He was, by the autumn of 1287, a man in his mid-40s, which in the 13th century was not middle age, but the beginning of old age. And he had spent those decades in nearly continuous conflict. He had suppressed rebellions by his own nobles. He had been excommunicated by his own bishop over a territorial dispute. He had watched his kingdom be humiliated by forces that no individual Polish ruler could have stopped alone. He was not a man who carried hope lightly. But what he carried in that moment, looking out over the frozen Vistula plain toward the distant glow of Mongol campfires, was something older and harder than hope. It was the conviction, settled, cold, and absolute as the limestone beneath his boots, that what he had built would hold. Across the frozen ground, in the Mongol encampments that stretched east and south of the city, the mood was entirely different. The Mongol warrior did not know the concept of an impregnable fortress, because he had never needed to learn it. Every wall his grandfather had ever met had eventually fallen. Every army that had faced his kind in open battle had eventually broken. The cold did not trouble men raised on the Mongolian plateau, where temperatures dropped to levels that would be considered mythological in Polish experience. They were the army of Genghis Khan's legacy, riding horses bred for endurance over comfort, carrying composite bows that could drive an arrow through armor at 150 yards. They had conquered China. They had shattered the Caliphate of Baghdad. They had broken the Knights Templar, the Knights of St. John, the Teutonic Order, and every heavy cavalry formation Christian Europe had assembled to stop them. They had done all of this, and they fully expected to do it again. What they did not expect, what none of them, not Talabuga, not Nogai, not a single Noyan or two-men commander in the entire 30,000-strong force had accounted for, was the possibility that this time the trap was not theirs to set. Talabuga's 20,000 riders crossed the Vistula in the first week of December 1287, and they moved south and west with the mechanical confidence of men who had never needed a second plan. The northern column was the stronger of the two, 20,000 warriors reinforced by Ruthenian vassal forces under Duke Mstislav of Lutsk, Duke Volodymyr of Volhynia, and Duke Lev of Halich. Men who followed because the alternative was to be on the receiving end of what was about to happen to Poland. They spread across the landscape like spilled ink, detachments fanning out to raid the villages and farmsteads of the countryside, the main body driving south toward the Vistula crossing at Zawichost, with the intention of reaching Sandomierz, the major fortified city at the northern edge of Lesser Poland, and using it as the pivoting point for the sweep toward Krakow. Sandomierz did not cooperate. The garrison of Sandomierz had been reinforced before the invasion began. Its walls were stone, not the timber and earth constructions that had been demolished on Mongol orders in 1259, but proper limestone fortifications built after those demolitions, specifically to replace what had been taken. The garrison was armed, the garrison was supplied, and critically, The garrison knew that its job was not to defeat the Mongols in open battle. It was to absorb the assault and not fall. Every day that Sandomierzy's walls stood was a day that Talabuga's schedule slipped, that his supply situation worsened, that his men's confidence in the infallibility of Mongol siege warfare eroded just slightly, and that the main Polish army under Leszek moved into better position. The Mongols had no effective answer to a properly constructed stone wall. Their composite bows were masterworks of engineering. Layered horn, sinew and wood compressed into a weapon that could outrange and outpenetrate almost any other bow in the world. But arrows did not breach limestone. Their speed, their encirclement tactics, their terrifying ability to rain fire and death from horseback, none of it translated to siege warfare against a fortification that had been specifically designed to resist them. Talabuga detached forces to attempt the Wysogora Abbey in the mountains. The abbey held. He sent riders toward Tursko. Tursko held. His foraging parties pushed into the countryside and skirmished constantly with local Polish forces who had been instructed not to engage in pitched battle, but to bleed the Mongol column through 1,000 small cuts, sallies from fortified positions, ambushes in the forested valleys, supply line harassment that forced the Mongols to consume more of their own provisions than any campaign of this length should have required. But the skirmishing and the failed sieges were only the prelude. The instrument of Talabuga's real defeat was moving toward him through the snow-covered mountains, and he had no idea it was coming. Leszek II, the Black, had chosen his moment with the patience of a hunter who knows the quarry must eventually stop moving. He watched as Talabuga's column failed at Sandomierz, spread itself thin across the countryside, and committed its main striking force to the sequence of unsuccessful assaults that were costing men, horses, and morale with every passing day. He understood something fundamental about Mongol psychology. They did not believe in the possibility of a drawn-out defensive campaign that ended in their defeat, because that possibility had never existed before. Their confidence was their blindness, and their blindness was Leszek's weapon. The Świętokrzyska Mountains rose behind Talabuga's position in a series of forested ridges, and somewhere in those ridges, how many men, from which direction, at precisely what moment, was the force that would decide the northern campaign. Leszek moved his army through the mountain terrain in weather that made movement a punishment in itself. Cold that cracked leather, snow that swallowed the sound of hooves and boots in equal measure. The kind of darkness that falls in winter mountain forests at mid-afternoon, reducing visibility to the length of an outstretched arm. His men moved in it anyway, because their duke moved in it. And because they had been told enough about what was coming, that the cold no longer seemed like the worst possible outcome. The Battle of Łagów, December 20th, 1287. It was not the kind of battle that gets described in the same breath as Agincourt or Marathon, because its details are sparse in the surviving chronicles, and its exact course has been lost to 7 centuries of imprecise record-keeping. What the Polish annals give us is clear enough in its essentials. A Polish force of unknown but significant size, under Duke Leszek the Black, descended on the main column of Talabuga's army near Łagów in the Świętokrzyski Mountains, and the resulting engagement was a severe defeat for the Mongols. The terrain did exactly what Leszek had planned for it to do. It negated the Mongol cavalry advantage entirely. In the narrow valleys and forested ridgelines of the Holy Cross Range, 10,000 Mongol horsemen could not maneuver in the sweeping, encircling patterns that had shattered every European army that met them in open field. There was no room for the feigned retreat that had broken the Polish line at Tursko in 1241. There was no horizon to disappear over and reappear from at a different angle. There was only the forest, the snow, the narrowing valley walls, and Polish infantry coming down from the high ground with the full weight of disciplined, close-quarters fury. The Mongols broke. Not all at once. They were too experienced, too well trained, too proud for that. But they broke in the way that armies break, when the fundamental assumptions underlying their tactics turn out to be wrong. By the time the engagement ended, Talabuga's column had taken casualties severe enough to eliminate any realistic possibility of reaching Krakow before the end of winter. The retreat north and east began almost immediately after the battle. Gathering what loot the various raiding parties had accumulated, prisoners, livestock, household goods stripped from the countryside, Talabuga's forces pulled back through Kielce and turned toward their winter camp in Lviv. They reached it in January 1288. They were done. Nogai Khan's southern column arrived before the walls of Krakow on Christmas Eve, 1287. And what greeted them was an architectural declaration of intent so emphatic that a lesser commander would have turned around immediately. The city that Batu Khan's riders had burned to the ground in 1241 was gone. In its place stood a fortification that the intervening 46 years had built from the ashes up, with the specific lessons of 1241 informing every decision about where to put the stone and how thick to make it. The castle was entirely limestone. The walls were manned by crossbowmen, stationed at intervals precise enough to create overlapping fields of fire that left no dead zone in the killing ground. Catapults, the large counterweight-driven machines that the 13th century called trebuchets, sat ready on the towers, capable of hurling stones heavy enough to kill a horse at 200 yards, or scatter a formation of infantry attempting to approach the base of the wall. Nogai was one of the most experienced military minds of his era. He had besieged fortified positions before. He understood what he was looking at. And what he was looking at was a city that could not be taken in the time available to him without siege equipment he had not brought. But the decision to leave was not simple. The campaign had been ordered by Talabuga, and leaving Krakow untouched while Talabuga's column was supposed to be sweeping through the north meant admitting, at least implicitly, that the invasion had already failed in its primary objective. Nogai did not make that admission. Instead, he adapted. He divided his force into at least 3 detachments and sent them to do what the Golden Horde did when fortresses refused to fall. He let them loose on everything around the fortress instead. The countryside north and south of Krakow was stripped with brutal efficiency. Livestock driven away, grain stores emptied or burned, villages reduced to frozen ash and silence. It was the Mongol answer to a wall that would not break. You could not take everything inside it, but you could take everything outside it. And the message was the same. You are not safe. You will never be safe. The wall is only as wide as it is. Everything beyond it belongs to us. But south of Krakow, in the Podhale region beneath the Tatra Mountains, something unexpected interrupted this brutal calculation. The Gorals did not receive the message, or rather, they received it and declined to accept it. When Mongol raiding parties, detachments of dozens to hundreds of riders moving through the highland valleys to harvest the wealth of the shepherd communities, rode into the Podhale, they found that the valleys had a different character than the plains. The river Dunajec ran through carved limestone gorges, where a force of mounted archers could not fan out or maneuver. The mountain trails narrowed to single-file paths, where the advantage of numbers became a disadvantage, because the rider in front absorbed everything that came at him, while the riders behind could not bring their weapons to bear. And the Gorals knew every one of those trails, every one of those gorges, every frozen streambed that would give and swallow a horse's leg without warning. The confrontation on the Dunajec was less a battle than a sustained nightmare for the Mongol detachments involved. Men who had ridden from the shores of the Caspian Sea found themselves picked apart in mountain passes by Highlanders with hunting bows and axes. Men who melted back into the forest before a counterattack could be organized, who reappeared at a different point 3 hours later and did it again. The Mongol way of war required the enemy to stand still long enough to be annihilated. The Gorals did not stand still. They drove the raiding parties back from the Podhale entirely, and for the first time in the campaign, a Mongol force had been expelled from terrain it had entered not by a professional army or a fortified city, but by people who simply refused to be conquered. Nogai pulled his forces back and redirected them. The siege of Stary Sącz began. Stary Sącz was a fortified town at the southern edge of Lesser Poland, near the Poprad River, controlling the route through the Carpathian foothills toward Hungary. If the Krakow approach was closed and the Podhale was a killing ground, then Stary Sącz offered something. A position that could be besieged with conventional methods. A symbol of Polish resistance that, if it fell, might allow Nogai to claim at least a partial victory and return east without the campaign being a complete catastrophe. The siege began. The walls held. January 1288. The darkest month of a dark winter. Nogai's army had been in Polish territory for several weeks. It had failed to take Krakow. It had been expelled from the Podhale. It had broken itself against Stary Sącz without result. The men were cold, the horses were underfed, and the morale that had carried them west from the Ruthenian border was beginning to show the cracks that come from repeated, unexpected failure. Detachments sent to forage returned with less than they needed, their riders reporting that the countryside had either already been stripped by their own previous raiding or was too actively defended to approach safely. The supply situation was worsening with each day, and Stary Sącz's walls showed no sign of weakening. Nogai sent approximately 1,000 riders to the area immediately around Stary Sącz, a combined foraging and siege support detachment tasked with securing the perimeter, preventing relief from reaching the town, and gathering enough food and fodder to sustain the main force through the next phase of operations. 1,000 Mongol cavalry was not a trivial force. By any conventional military measurement, it was more than sufficient to handle anything that rural southern Poland was likely to put in its path. These were professional warriors, experienced riders, men who had spent their entire adult lives in military service to the Golden Horde. They deployed with the casual competence of people who had done this 100 times. From the south, from the mountain passes of the Carpathians, George of Sovar had been watching. The Hungarian expeditionary force had moved north through Podolinek and Kesmarok, gathering Polish local forces along the way, men who knew the terrain south of Stary Sącz in the same intimate way the Gorals knew the Podhale. George was not a famous general. He would not be remembered the way that Leszek the Black was remembered, or the way that Nogai would be remembered, because what he did at Stary Sącz was clean and simple, and entirely without the kind of complexity that generates centuries of scholarly argument. He moved his force to within striking distance of the Mongol detachment without being detected. A feat that required either exceptional woodsmanship, exceptional luck, or both. And then he attacked. The silence before the Hungarian-Polish charge broke like glass. One moment, There was only the sound of wind moving through the frozen Poprad Valley, the creak of ice under the feet of the Mongol horses, the distant murmur of men talking in a language that had originated 3,000 miles to the east. Then the tree line erupted. The Hungarian and Polish cavalry came out of the forest at full charge, and the Mongol detachment, 1,000 men who had been expecting nothing, who had been deployed in the loose formation appropriate for foraging rather than the tight defensive posture appropriate for a surprise engagement, had approximately 3 seconds to understand what was happening before the impact. Those 3 seconds were not enough. The charge broke the Mongol detachment before it could reorganize into a defensive formation. Men who tried to mount were struck down while their feet were still reaching for the stirrups. Men who were already mounted found that there was no room to accelerate, no room to execute the sweeping turn that would have allowed them to bring their bows to bear. The confined terrain that had frustrated their tactics everywhere else in this campaign frustrated them here at the final and most decisive moment. The engagement was brief. It was total. Every one of the 1,000 Mongol riders was killed. The commander of the detachment, his name has not survived in the sources, lost in the imprecision of medieval chronicle keeping, died with his men. The snow around Stary Sącz turned red, then black, then was covered by fresh snowfall that came in the night after the battle, as though the earth itself was trying to smooth over what had been done there. The horses that had not been killed stood in the aftermath without riders, their reins dragging in the bloodied snow, their breath steaming in the January air. 1,000 men had ridden out that morning. None rode back. The news of Stary Sącz reached Nogai's main force, and for a man of his experience, the calculation it required was not complicated. He had failed at Krakow. He had been broken in the Podhale. He had lost 1,000 men in a single engagement at Stary Sącz. And now, from the intelligence his scouts were bringing in, he understood that Leszek the Black, who had just defeated Talabuga's northern column in the mountains, was moving south to join forces with the Hungarian contingent that had just annihilated his forward detachment. 2 armies converging on a force that had already been diminished, demoralized, and stripped of the supply lines it needed to sustain further operations. Nogai Khan, the man who had never truly believed in the legitimacy of the Khan above him, the man who had survived 6 decades of steppe politics by being the most ruthless calculator in any room he entered, made the decision that only a man who genuinely understood his situation would make. He ordered the retreat. It was not a rout. Nogai was too experienced a commander to allow it to become a rout. He pulled his remaining forces together with the discipline that had made him famous, consolidated the loot that had been gathered, organized the few hundred prisoners that the campaign had managed to collect, far fewer than the tens of thousands that previous invasions had returned with, and began the march east. Back through the frozen countryside that his riders had already stripped. Back through the Ruthenian frontier. Back toward the winter camps at Lviv, where Talabuga's humiliated northern column had already arrived. He reached Ruthenia in late January 1288, and in a final act of fury that said everything about the psychological state of the Golden Horde in the aftermath of this campaign, Nogai's men plundered the villages of his own Galician vassal lords on the way back, as though the anger that Poland had refused to absorb had to be discharged somewhere, and his own people were the nearest available target. The silence that settled over Lesser Poland in the last days of January 1288 was different from the silence of December. That had been the silence of held breath, of terror awaiting confirmation, of a kingdom bracing for what it had been told was inevitable. This was the silence of aftermath, a quieter, stranger thing, full of disbelief and a slowly dawning realization that was almost too large to hold in a single human mind. They were gone. The Mongols were gone. And for the first time in the history of these invasions, Poland had made them leave. The soldiers came out of the fortified cities slowly, the way men emerge from a cellar after a storm has passed, uncertain, blinking, needing a moment to confirm that the world they left was still approximately the world they returned to. In Krakow, the gates opened in the days following Nogai's retreat, and the citizens who had sheltered behind the stone walls while Mongol fires burned the countryside to the south and east emerged into a city that was intact. The castles stood. The churches stood. The market square was empty of everything except wind and old snow, but it was there, and it was theirs, and the fact of its continued existence felt, in those first hours, like something close to miraculous. The countryside told a different story. The territory between the fortified cities, the farms, the villages, the small settlements that had neither walls nor garrison, bore the full cost of the Mongol passage. Granaries stripped or burned, livestock driven east as provisions for the retreating columns, structures reduced to the characteristic ash and timber ruins that followed the Golden Horde like a shadow. The human cost in the rural areas was significant, though the medieval chronicles do not offer precise figures. They offer instead the language of lament, the kind of description that communicates scale without numbers. Great destruction, many slain, the land laid waste. The exact death toll of the 1287–88 invasion will never be known. What is known is that it was considerably lower than either of the two previous invasions, because the strategy of concentrating the population in fortified positions had worked as intended. The people who had reached the walls had lived. The people who had not reached the walls had paid the price that all civilians pay when armies move through their homes. But no major city had fallen. No castle had been taken. Not Krakow, not Sandomierz, not Wysogóra Abbey, not Stary Sącz. Not a single fortified position in all of Lesser Poland had been breached by a Mongol assault. And that fact, unprecedented in the entire history of Mongol operations in Poland, was the measure of what Leszek the Black had accomplished. The Mongol casualties were substantial by the standards of any campaign in which an army fails every one of its primary objectives. At Łagów, Talabuga's main striking force had taken a defeat severe enough to end the northern axis of the campaign entirely. At Stary Sącz, a full detachment of 1,000 men had been annihilated to the last rider, their commander killed in an engagement they never had a chance to properly join. In the Podhale, raiding parties had suffered the accumulated attrition of a guerrilla campaign waged by people who knew the terrain intimately. Across the whole campaign, the Mongols had taken fewer prisoners and collected less loot than any invasion in their history of attacking Poland. The humiliation was not only military, it was economic, it was reputational. Talabuga Khan limped back to his winter camp with the knowledge that the campaign he had needed to establish his legitimacy as Khan had instead established something quite different. That he was the Khan who had led the Golden Horde into Poland and come back empty-handed. He had Nogai to blame, of course, and he did blame him, loudly, in the councils that followed. He blamed the poor river crossings, the unexpected stone walls, the unhelpfulness of his Ruthenian vassals, the terrain, the weather, the timing. He blamed everything except the possibility that his enemy had simply outthought him. Nogai returned to his territory in the west of the Golden Horde's domains, with his political instincts already moving past the failure in Poland and calculating what came next. The shared disaster of the campaign had done nothing to repair the relationship between the two commanders. If anything, it had deepened the mutual contempt that Polish historian Stefan Krakowski would later identify as one of the two primary causes of the invasion's failure. The other cause, Krakowski observed, was the stone walls. The rivalry and the stone walls together had turned the largest Mongol invasion of Poland in history into its most complete failure. These two things, one built by a duke's patient hand, one a function of the enmity between two proud men who could not cooperate, combined to produce an outcome that neither the Mongols nor most of Europe had imagined possible. Leszek II the Black entered Krakow as a conqueror of sorts, a man who had defended rather than destroyed, who had held rather than taken, but who had accomplished something that his predecessors across 4 decades of Mongol pressure had been unable to achieve. He had made Lesser Poland unconquerable. He had done it without the romantic flourish of a great set-piece battle in an open field, without the kind of singular, heroic moment that makes for simple chronicle entries and clear-cut legacy. He had done it through construction, patience, and the willingness to let his own countryside burn while he waited for the right moment to strike. A calculation that was strategically brilliant and humanly brutal in equal measure. He would not live long enough to see the full consequences of what he had done. Leszek II the Black died on September 30th, 1288, 8 months after the last Mongol rider crossed back into Ruthenia. He was, by contemporary standards, an old man. He was buried in the Dominican Church of the Holy Trinity in Krakow. The kingdom he had defended would spend the next generation fighting over who would inherit his position in the hierarchy of Piast dukes, and the unification he may have dreamed of would not come until the reign of Vladislav I, the Elbow High, his half-brother's stepson, in the early 14th century. He did not live to see Poland united, but he lived long enough to see Poland hold. 3 years after Stary Sącz, in 1291, Nogai Khan arranged a private meeting with Talabuga under the pretense of giving him important personal counsel. Talabuga arrived with only a small retinue, having been persuaded by his own mother that the meeting was safe. It was not safe. Nogai's men surrounded the gathering point, captured Talabuga and his supporters before they could react, and Talabuga was strangled to death, killed by a trap he had not seen coming, set by a man who had spent years pretending to be his ally. The symmetry is almost too neat to be coincidence, and yet it was not designed. It was simply the nature of the world that Talabuga had occupied, a world where the failure to see a trap coming was a terminal condition. No Mongol army of comparable scale ever marched into Poland again. The campaign of 1287 to 1288 was the last great Mongol invasion of Polish territory, and its failure was not a historical accident. It was the direct consequence of a strategic transformation that one duke had imposed on his fractured, battered, twice humiliated kingdom through decades of quiet, unromantic, essential work. The stone walls were the obvious lesson, and every ruler in Central Europe absorbed it. If you wanted to resist the Golden Horde, you needed fortifications that cavalry could not breach, positioned close enough together that a mobile defensive force could respond to threats anywhere along the line without leaving any single point undefended. Poland had discovered this at enormous cost, rebuilt accordingly, and proved the concept under the most demanding possible test conditions. The nations on its flanks were watching. Hungary had already begun its own fortification programme after the disaster of 1241, and the 1285 repulsion of Nogai and Talabuga from Hungarian territory had confirmed the same lessons that Poland was demonstrating in 1287. Together, the Polish and Hungarian campaigns of the 1280s effectively closed the Central European corridor to large-scale Mongol invasion. The golden age of the Golden Horde's westward expansion was over. Not because the Horde suddenly weakened, but because the kingdoms in its path had finally learned, through terrible experience, what it took to stop it. That learning process had cost Poland 2 invasions, 2 burnings, and the forced demolition of its before. The campaign itself. The deeper consequences ran through the political structure of the Golden Horde like a fault line. The mutual recrimination between Talabuga and Nogai in the aftermath of the Polish failure intensified with each subsequent failed campaign, reaching its culmination in Nogai's 1291 ambush of the Khan. But the death of Talabuga did not stabilize the Horde. It accelerated the internal divisions that would fracture it over the following decades. The man Nogai installed as a replacement Khan, Tokhta, turned out to be precisely what Nogai had not expected: a ruler with his own will and his own agenda. Within 2 years, Nogai and Tokhta were at war with each other in earnest. By 1299, Nogai himself was dead, killed in the conflict with the Khan he had created. The Horde would lurch from crisis to crisis through the following century, its western power gradually eroding, its ability to project force into Central Europe diminishing with each internal convulsion. The seed of that dissolution was planted in many places and over many years. But somewhere, in the frozen mountain passes of the Świętokrzyski range, in the blood-darkened snow outside the walls of Stary Sącz, ground. And then there is the story the people of Krakow told themselves about what happened. History is sometimes too large and too complicated for a single human heart to hold entire. And so communities distill it, compress it into legend, into symbol, into a figure that can be carried through the generations without a library of footnotes. The legend of Lykonic says that in 1287, while the Mongols camped in the bulrushes along the Vistula near the village of Zwierzyniec, they were discovered by a group of local raftsmen, the Włóczkowie, the log drivers who worked the river, who fell upon the sleeping invaders and killed them. Dressed then in the captured Mongol armour, their leader mounted on a seized horse, the raftsmen rode into Krakow in mock Tartar guise, striking the astonished citizens with the dead commander's mace. And everyone laughed, because the thing they had feared the most had become a costume, a joke, a game. The mayor of Krakow decreed that the event would be commemorated annually, and it has been every first Thursday after Corpus Christi for 700 years. A man in richly embroidered Mongol robes, a pointed Tartar hat, a wooden horse strapped to his waist, moves through the medieval streets of Krakow and taps passers-by with a golden mace. And the tap is said to bring good fortune for the coming year. This is what survival looks like when enough time has passed. The terror becomes a costume. The conqueror becomes a jester. The existential threat becomes the thing you dress up as to make your neighbours laugh. The Lajkonik is not accurate history, but it is true in the way that only legends can be true. It captures the essential emotional fact of what happened in the winter of 1287 to 1288, which is that Poland looked at the thing it feared most in the world and did not run from it. And the thing that had always run over Poland found, for the first time, that Poland had learned to hold its ground. Leszek the Black is buried in Krakow. The stone walls he built are gone, replaced by the centuries of reconstruction and expansion that transformed his medieval fortress city into one of the great cultural capitals of Europe. The Świętokrzyskie Mountains still stand over the Łagów Valley, forested and quiet. The ridgelines where Polish soldiers descended on Talabuga's column, now visible only to hikers who know where to look. The Poprad Valley below Stary Sącz is farmland now, peaceful in the way that land becomes peaceful when enough centuries separate the living from the dying that happened there. But every June, in Krakow, the Lajkonik rides again. He moves from the old Premonstratensian convent in Zwierzyniec through the winding medieval streets to the main market square, his musicians playing, his retinue dancing, the crowd parting and pressing in to receive the tap of his golden mace. And at the square, the mayor of the city waits for him with a ceremonial ransom and a chalice. And they drink together to the continued prosperity and safety of Krakow, exactly as the raftsmen drank 7 centuries ago, after the morning they rode into their city wearing dead men's armour and carrying news that no one quite dared to believe. The Mongols are not coming. They came 3 times. They burned, and they killed, and they broke what people had built. And they came back and did it again. But the 3rd time, Poland was ready. The 3rd time, the walls held, the trap closed, and the horde that had crossed half the known world turned its horses east and did not return. Centuries later, the stones remember. The festival continues. And somewhere under the limestone streets of Krakow, in the foundations of a city that chose to be unconquerable, the echo of that January morning still carries. The thunder of retreating hooves, growing fainter, fainter, until even the mountains can no longer hear them.